If you were to walk through this area today, you would never guess a city once stood here. This place is called Harbour. Even Google Maps doesn't really explain what it used to be. In this video, we are exploring 13 ghost towns across Canada that Google Maps either hides, ignores, or simply cannot fully explain, because in reality, they are nothing more than history buried under nature. And we are not talking about the well-known abandoned towns featured in travel guides. These are places that have been demolished, swallowed by forests, erased by time, or made so remote that reaching them requires serious effort, special directions, or even crossing forbidden ground. Google Maps gives the illusion that everything is documented. But these places reveal the limits of that illusion. A single point on a map cannot tell you that thousands of people once built their lives there. It cannot show you how entire towns were erased by nature, industry, or disaster. It cannot explain how forests quietly reclaimed everything that once stood. Let's begin with number 13, Rowley, Alberta. We start with Rowley, one of the easiest ghost towns to reach on this list, making it a perfect introduction. At its peak, around the 1920s and 1930s, about 350 people lived here. Today, the official population is 0, although a few caretakers still look after the buildings. Rowley is located roughly 40 kilometers southwest of Drumheller. Unlike most ghost towns, this one is accessible by paved road. Rowley is often described as Alberta's unofficial official ghost town. The buildings are still standing rather than collapsing. You can walk into the old general store, hotel, and church as if time stopped decades ago. It has even been used as a filming location for several movies and TV productions. The town also hosts a strange annual event known as Last Chicken Standing, involving rubber chickens, which is exactly as unusual as it sounds. Locals often say Rowley is not a ghost town because of tragedy, but because people simply left while the buildings remained behind. Like many prairie communities, it declined due to drought, economic hardship, mechanization in farming, and population shifts towards cities. Over time, rail service decreased, businesses closed, and by the 1980s, the town had effectively died out. What makes Rowley unusual is that it was never destroyed or bulldozed. Instead, a small group of locals preserved it. Today, the old saloon still hosts occasional gatherings, and the abandoned gas station still looks like it could serve fuel at any moment, even though it hasn't for decades. On Google Maps, Rowley appears as just another rural point. Nothing suggests it is a preserved ghost town until you actually arrive and find a frozen main street from another era. 12. Leach Collieries, Alberta. Next is Leach Collieries, a site tied closely to industrial history and tragedy. Between 1907 and 1915, around 150 to 200 miners lived and worked here. Today, no one lives there. It is officially a historic site, but most travelers passing through Highway 3 never stop to explore it. The mine was originally built to supply coal for steam locomotives operated by the Canadian Pacific Railway. The site included large industrial structures such as coke ovens, power facilities, and housing for workers. At the time, even basic comforts like indoor plumbing and management homes were considered rare. However, by 1915, economic decline hit hard. Demand for coal dropped, and larger mining operations made smaller sites like this unprofitable. The mine shut down after less than a decade. What remains today is the most striking part. Over 100 coke ovens still stand in rows. They resemble ancient ruins placed in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by untouched wilderness. Not far from here lies one of Canada's most tragic disasters, Frank Slide, where millions of tons of rock buried a town and killed dozens of people. Despite its scale and history, Leach Collieries is often overlooked. On Google Maps, it appears simply as a historic point with no explanation of its scale or significance. 11 Balaclava, Ontario. Balaclava is one of the hardest ghost towns to even locate in Ontario. At its peak, it had around 400 to 500 residents in the 1880s. Today, the population is 0. What makes Balaclava unusual is that it barely exists on modern maps. On Google Maps, it is reduced to little more than a road intersection, with no clear indication that an entire community once lived and worked there. The town originally grew around the Bristol Iron Mine in Renfrew County, about 25 kilometers from the town of Renfrew. Iron ore was discovered in the 1860s and 1870s, and a full mining settlement quickly formed. It had churches, schools, hotels, and general stores, a complete small industrial community. But the iron deposits were limited. When richer mining regions in Minnesota and Michigan became dominant, Ontario's iron industry collapsed in this area. The mine closed, and without it, there was no reason for Balaclava to survive. Nature slowly reclaimed everything. Today, the forest hides what remains of foundations and old structures beneath the trees. Unless you know exactly where to look, there is no sign that people ever lived here. The cemetery is one of the only visible traces left, still visited and maintained by descendants. Old mine shafts remain open and dangerous, and over the years, several accidents have occurred there. Balaclava takes its name from the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War, the same origin as the Balaclava ski mask. 10. Val-Jalbert, Quebec. Val-Jalbert is one of the most visually striking ghost towns in Canada. At its peak in 1926, it had around 950 residents. Today, there are no permanent inhabitants. Located in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region, about 8 kilometers from Roberval, the town was built around a pulp mill, constructed in 1901 at the base of a 7-2-meter waterfall, even taller than Niagara Falls. The entire town was a company settlement, built to support mill workers. Over 80 buildings were constructed, including homes, a convent, a general store, a butcher shop, and full community infrastructure for nearly 1,000 people. By the mid-1920s, Val-Jalbert was thriving. The mill produced groundwood pulp shipped across North America. But in 1927, everything changed. The pulp market collapsed, and the company shut down operations almost overnight. Within just a few months, all 950 residents left. The company simply abandoned the town. Unlike many ghost towns, Val-Jalbert was not completely destroyed. Instead, it was partially preserved and restored by the Quebec government. Some buildings were rebuilt, while others were intentionally left in a controlled state of decay. Today, visitors can walk through empty streets beneath the roaring waterfall. The convent has even been converted into a hotel, and some restored houses can be rented overnight, allowing people to sleep inside a ghost town. 9. Quesnel Forks, British Columbia. Quesnel Forks is a remote ghost town in British Columbia that requires effort to reach. At its peak in the 1860s, it had over 5,000 residents. Today, the population is 0. The town is located at the meeting point of the Quesnel and Caribou Rivers, about 100 kilometers from Quesnel via gravel roads. It originally developed as a key supply hub during the Caribou Gold Rush. In 1859, gold was discovered nearby, and thousands of miners rushed into the region. By 1861, Quesnel Forks had become one of the largest settlements in British Columbia, complete with hotels, saloons, stores, and even a courthouse. But the boom didn't last. Richer gold discoveries in other areas pulled miners away, and the Caribou Road bypassed the town. By the 1870s, most of the population had already left. Chinese miners later continued working the remaining claims into the early 1900s, after many others abandoned them. Their presence is still visible today through separate Chinese and European cemeteries, reflecting the town's layered mining history. Only a few restored structures remain, along with interpretive signs maintained by heritage groups. On Google Maps, it appears as just a small point with no indication it was once one of the largest towns in the region. 8. Sandon, British Columbia. Sandon is different from most ghost towns because it never fully died. It simply collapsed to a tiny remnant of its former self. At its peak in 1898, Sandon had around 5,000 residents. Today, only about 5 to 10 people remain. Located in the Slocan Valley near New Denver, Sandon was once a booming silver mining town built on some of the richest deposits in Canada. At its height, it had 29 hotels, 28 saloons, multiple banks, an opera house, and even electric street lighting, making it one of the most advanced towns in British Columbia at the time. However, disaster repeatedly struck. Fires destroyed hundreds of buildings in 1900, forcing reconstruction. Later, silver prices collapsed. Floods damaged the town multiple times, and by 1955, a major flood destroyed most remaining structures. Even so, a small group of residents refused to leave. Remarkably, Sandon's original 1,897 hydroelectric plant is still operational today, making it one of the oldest functioning power stations in British Columbia. The main street has become a rough path, and a small museum operates seasonally. On Google Maps, Sandon appears, but nothing suggests its dramatic past or the fact that anything meaningful still survives. 7 Phoenix, British Columbia. Phoenix is where the list starts feeling unreal. At its peak in 1911, Phoenix had over 4,000 residents. That made it larger than Vancouver at the time, a fact that feels almost impossible today, given what remains. Today, the population is 0, and 0 here is literal. There is almost nothing left to identify a former city. Phoenix was located at about 1,400 meters elevation near Greenwood, British Columbia, making it one of the highest cities in Canada. It was built around copper mining after deposits were discovered in 1891. The Granby Mining Company developed massive open-pit operations that turned the area into a full industrial city. By 1911, Phoenix had everything: a newspaper, 2 railway lines, hotels, churches, a hospital, and a full urban infrastructure. Even its hockey team, the Phoenix Smelters, was well known across British Columbia. Then World War I ended, copper demand collapsed, and ore deposits began to run out. By 1919, Granby Mining shut everything down. Within months, the population disappeared. Buildings were either dismantled for materials or left to decay. Later, modern mining operations further reshaped the land, essentially erasing what remained of the original city. Today, on Google Maps, you see only roads and an open-pit mine. No clear sign that a city of 4,000 people once stood there. You can literally stand on the ground where a city existed and see almost nothing but grass, rock, and excavation scars. Phoenix rose quickly and vanished even faster. Cis Nord, Alberta. Nord is one of the few ghost towns on this list where life partially returned but only in a limited, controlled way. At its peak in the 1940s, Nord had around 3,500 residents. Today, about 50 people live there, mainly connected to tourism and heritage operations. Located roughly 80 kilometers west of Rocky Mountain House, Nord was founded after coal deposits were discovered in 1907 by Martin Nord, a German-Canadian entrepreneur. It became a model mining town, with modern infrastructure for its time: schools, housing, hospitals, and industrial facilities. But the town's history also carries tragedy. In 1941, a mine explosion killed 29 workers. Some bodies were never recovered, and parts of the mine were sealed permanently with remains still inside. The mine continued operating until 1955, when coal demand collapsed due to changes in transportation. Within a year, the town was abandoned. Today, Nord is known for its preserved industrial ruins, coke ovens, mine buildings, and company housing foundations still remain. Some structures have been converted into accommodations and tourism sites. One of the most haunting details is the underground mine tour. Visitors are told that in some sealed sections, the remains of miners are still present and have never been retrieved. On Google Maps, Nord appears as a small settlement, but there is no indication of its industrial scale or its dark mining history. Viisi Elsa, Yukon. Elsa feels like a place frozen in time. At its peak in the 1960s and 1970s, Elsa had around 750 residents. Today, the population is 0. Located along Yukon Highway 11, about 50 kilometers from Mayo, Elsa sits deep in remote territory along the Silver Trail. It was built after silver and lead deposits were discovered in 1919 at Keno Hill. United Keno Hill Mines developed the town into a fully functioning mining community. By the 1960s, it had housing, a school, recreation facilities, and a complete industrial system supporting silver extraction. But by the 1980s, silver prices collapsed. In 1989, the mining company went bankrupt, burdened by environmental costs and declining production. The town was abandoned almost overnight. What makes Elsa remarkable is how intact it still is. The cold subarctic climate, preserved buildings, machinery, and infrastructure. Mill structures, headframes, housing blocks, and industrial equipment are still standing. Even vehicles remain parked exactly where they were left in 1989. It genuinely feels like everyone left yesterday. However, the site is contaminated with heavy metals, and environmental risks remain. Exploration is restricted in many areas. On Google Maps, Elsa appears as just a point on the map, but satellite imagery reveals a full industrial town, mostly unnamed, mostly forgotten. 4 Fort Selkirk, Yukon. Fort Selkirk is not just remote, it is unreachable by road. There are no roads leading here. The only access is by boat or plane. At its peak, from the late 1800s through the 1940s, Fort Selkirk had over 200 residents. Today, it is completely uninhabited. The Hudson's Bay Company established the trading post in 1848 at the meeting point of the Yukon and Pelly Rivers. It became an important stop during the Klondike Gold Rush, with steamboats regularly passing through. The community had churches, schools, and government services. But in 1942, the construction of the Alaska Highway bypassed Fort Selkirk entirely, shifting transportation routes away from the settlement. As river traffic declined, the town slowly emptied. By the late 1950s, the last permanent residents had left. Today, around 40 historic buildings remain, including a church, school, and trading post structures maintained by the Selkirk First Nation as a heritage site. Seasonal programs bring limited activity back to the area during summer months. On Google Maps, you can see the structures in satellite view, but there is no indication of access routes or modern roads because there are none. It remains a fully preserved 19th century settlement, reachable only by water or air. Trois-Gagnons, Quebec. Gagnon is one of the most complete erasures on this entire list. At its peak in the 1970s, it had around 4,000 residents. Today, nothing remains. Not ruins, not foundations, nothing. The town was built in the 1960s by Quebec Cartier Mining Company in northern Quebec, about 200 kilometers from Labrador and 500 kilometers from Sept Îles. It was created entirely from scratch to support iron ore mining operations. By the 1970s, Gagnon had modern infrastructure, schools, a hospital, housing, shops, and full community services. It functioned as a fully developed industrial town. But in the early 1980s, iron ore prices collapsed. In 1985, the mining operations shut down. What happened next is what makes Gagnon different from most ghost towns. It was completely demolished. Every building was torn down. Foundations were removed. The cemetery was relocated. Even physical traces of the town were erased. The goal was not abandonment, it was elimination. Today, satellite images show only forest and faint road outlines. If you visit the site, you find empty clearings in the boreal forest where streets once existed. 4,000 people lived there for 25 years. Then, it was as if the town had never existed at all. 2. Lemieux, Ontario. Lemieux is not a ghost town in the traditional sense. It is a place the earth itself removed. At its peak, Lemieux had around 65 residents living in roughly 15 homes. It was never a large settlement, just a small francophone farming village in eastern Ontario, located along the South Nation River, about 70 kilometers from Ottawa. The community had existed quietly since the 1870s, with a church, a few small businesses, and family farms spread across the rural landscape. For more than a century, life here continued without major incident. Then the ground beneath the village became the problem. Geologists discovered that Lemieux was built on quick clay, a highly unstable marine clay capable of suddenly liquefying under pressure. The same type of soil had already caused deadly collapses in other parts of Canada. Warnings were issued for years, but many residents and officials were skeptical. Moving an entire village of 65 people seemed unnecessary to some. Eventually, in 1991, the decision was made to evacuate the entire community. Residents were relocated, and even the village church was physically moved elsewhere. At the time, the evacuation was controversial. Many believed the risk had been exaggerated. 2 years later, on the 20th of June 1993, the ground gave way. About 17 hectares of land suddenly liquefied and slid into the South Nation River. The event formed what is now known as Lemieux Island. Geologists later confirmed that if the evacuation had not taken place, the entire village would have been pulled into the collapse. Today, if you search Lemieux on Google Maps, you will find only the island but almost no trace of the village that once stood there. The original site is unstable, unmarked, and largely left alone. A community of over a century disappeared not by fire, war, or abandonment, but by the ground simply giving out. 1 Depot Harbour, Ontario. Depot Harbour is arguably the most complete disappearance of a major settlement in Canadian history. At its peak in the 1920s, it had around 3,000 residents and was considered Canada's third busiest port, competing with major Great Lakes hubs like Montreal in terms of trade activity. Located near Parry Sound on Georgian Bay, Depot Harbour was built in 1897 by railway magnate J.R. Booth as a major shipping terminus for grain and freight. Massive grain elevators dominated the skyline, storing millions of bushels destined for Europe. Steamships, rail lines, warehouses, hotels, and residential districts all formed a fully functioning industrial port town. For a time, it was thriving. Some even called it the Chicago of Georgian Bay. But its rise was short-lived. After Booth's railway was absorbed by the Grand Trunk Railway in 1905, traffic began shifting elsewhere. Over time, shipping routes changed, and the town's strategic importance declined. Then came a series of devastating events. In 1933, the grain elevators burned. In 1945, another major fire destroyed much of what remained. By 1952, the railway was abandoned entirely. After that, nature took over. Forests slowly reclaimed the site. Buildings collapsed or were dismantled. Concrete foundations and scattered industrial remnants are all that remain today. On Google Maps, Depot Harbour appears as a quiet point near the shoreline, with almost no indication that a major industrial port once operated here. If you visit today, you can still find traces, foundation outlines, fragments of the grain elevators, and remnants of railway infrastructure. But most of it is gone, hidden beneath dense forest. 3,000 people once lived here. Ships crossed oceans from this exact point, and now it is silence, trees, and forgotten concrete.